We're joined today by Dr. Benjamin Gilmer. He's an international Albert Schweitzer Fellow. He's the medical director for the Mountain Area Health and Education Center's Rural Initiatives. And also, the reason we're here today, you're the author of The Other Dr. Gilmer. So thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
So we'll start just, the book, The Other Dr. Gilmer. It's about, the doctor who started the practice that you started working at, happens to share a last name with you.
Mm-hmm.
Just can you give us a brief synopsis of who he is and what this story was all about?
The Other Dr. Gilmer is a story about me intersecting with another Dr. Gilmer, taking over his practice, his clinic. I'm a family medicine physician, and realizing after sharing common patients that he committed a brutal murder, and that led to a pursuit to. I became very curious about what happened to him, and that led to a decade-long pursuit to understand who the other Dr. Gilmer was, because he was sort of a ghost in our clinic. And then I realized that he had brutally murdered his father, and that I needed to figure out what happened to him. And that journey has guided me towards learning how to be a student in many ways about writing and advocacy, and doing and leveraging the media for advocacy and change. But that took a while to figure that out. I had to go visit him in prison and realize that he wasn't just the cold-blooded murderer that everyone believed him to be, that he was actually a sick person who had been branded as a malingerer, that he was faking these sort of bizarre symptoms while he was in prison, while he was being tried, after he fired his lawyers. So it was a crazy scenario for him. Yeah. So the story is about, it ultimately turned into be a memoir, but not because I wanted it to be, it just happened to be that way. And but it's a story about me discovering myself as a physician, walking in the shadows of a presumed murderer with the same name, and then learning a lot about our system, our carceral system, our mass incarceration problem in America, our lack of mental health access, all these things that really contribute to to the great demise of our society right now.
You said early on in the book, it was you took the job because you needed a job to pay the bills, but at the same time, your kind of experiences were uniquely qualified you to work in rural medicine. Your experiences in Africa. What is it about kind of rural medicine that drew you to the position at Cane Creek originally?
Yeah, so family doctors oftentimes work in rural spaces, and we have a residency program here in Boone at the hospital. We have a AHEC residency program that trains family doctors to be rural doctors. And after living and working in Africa and Ecuador and some other places, I learned that the health of a community really is dependent on access to primary care. And so that was the great allure to me, that you can, as a family doctor, you can be deeply ingrained in the community. It's the most affordable care for patients. And with that responsibility, it asks you to beg questions about people. We're sort of the first line of defense and sometimes the last line of defense for patients. And I'd learned that the other Dr. Gilmer had neither. He didn't have a lawyer. He didn't have a doctor. There was no one who looked into his case at all. And so I think the curiosity that most rural doctors have really was sort of the beginning for my pursuit to understand who this other person was. But I think rural doctors in general are kind of unique in that they really care about the community in general, and that deep-seated curiosity makes them ask the next question about their patients, or in my case, my predecessor.
Yeah. What were some of those, when you got to know his former patients, your current patients? What were some of those first stories that you heard about the other Dr. Gilmer like?
Yeah, I was inspired to know more about the other Dr. Gilmer because his patients who became my patients, this was my first job. And those patients wanted to speak, they wanted to tell all kinds of stories about him. And they were mostly stories of how he affected their lives positively, how he was like integral to getting to know their families, how he would accept vegetables for, for instead of payment, how he would attend their children's like t-ball games and stuff like that. But really they wanted to tell me that they didn't understand why their beloved physician committed this murder. And they were clearly like searching for an answer. And then that kind of inspired me to want to search for an answer, because they were so convincing of their story of the other Dr. Gilmer, that he was a good man, a good doctor, and then something terrible happened, and no one could reconcile who their doctor was and this terrible event.
One of the things that struck me as someone who's living in Boone, as I'm reading this, is, it says he was going to go canoeing with his father on Watauga Lake. And I was like, oh my God, like I've been boating on Watauga Lake, like that hits really close to home. And like, obviously you've written the book now, you've traveled, some of the country telling this story, what's the importance of, is it different at all telling it, in places that like that hits close to home for you, like to be up here in Watauga County and be like, oh, and you're from Asheville, it's like, oh, this is close to home for you, and it hits for like the people in this area.
Yeah, I mean, this is an Appalachian story. It's a regional story. It's one that has touched our community deeply, because it was a very troubling event when it happened. But he loved this area. He would come here camping often. But his story is a regional story, but it's also a very universal story, because it tells the story of how one man's brain went awry. And his brain going awry can be symbolic of all of our brains having trouble. And so people have related to the other Dr. Gilmer's story, because we're all touched by mental illness. Like it's everywhere. It's in Watauga County, it's in Buncombe County, it's in every county. And people relate to that, I think, because for some folks, his patients especially, it was an opportunity to reflect on their own mental health. And to question how we all share something very in common, which is a sense of shared cognitive fallibility, that we all have highs and lows. And that's in every county in America, so people can relate to that.
Yeah, I think kind of one of the things that you've learned through this is the kind of like how the judicial system handles mental health, and they don't handle it very well. And one of the things you said was that they looked through this case from a prosecutorial lens and not a medical lens. Is there something that, how do you change that? How do you work within the legal system to change how, we view mental health and how we handle mental health in, people that are going through the legal system?
That is a really good question. And for me, writing this story about the other Dr. Gilmer was a process of a pursuit to learn, in part like where we are in our system, because our medical system is oftentimes very divorced from the legal system. The mental health system is oftentimes very divorced from the carceral system. It turns out, however, that 60%, up to 60% of incarcerated people are experiencing severe mental illness. And that's also universal, like quote, that's everywhere. And the understanding of that for me was like a transformational moment. How do we fix that system is an exploration that all of us are going to have to take together, because it's, I love when I talk to law enforcement agencies or lawyers, or judges, like they all recognize that, it's not their problem to solve. Like they can do their part. We could do our part as physicians, but it takes everyone to do their part, because the system is so complicated. It's so big. And, like Medicaid expansion in North Carolina was a very, very important step towards enabling access to care for people with mental illness and people without mental illness. Looking upstream requires, having good kindergarten teachers. It requires having good parents. It requires women having the opportunity to be home with their babies for 6 months after delivering. And that requires way more than cops and lawyers and doctors. Like it takes an army of people to look at this through a different lens. But for me, after I started seeing the judicial system, mass incarceration through a clinical lens, which was in part what inspired me to write this book, is that if you apply the Hippocratic Oath to everyone, that you will do no harm, and you start to see people who are struggling as people who are compromised, people who are not as lucky, people who need to be healed, like in a way. Once you see that and recognize that, then I think it enables you to have a deeper empathy, to see someone in need in a different light. Yeah. If you're a prosecutor, the light you see is your job is to put that person behind bars. Like that is your job. That's your unique focus. The defense attorney has the same job. Their job is to get people out of prison. And so, but nobody, they haven't taken the oath. And the oath, I think, it really enables you to see people in a different way with empathy.
Are there, I mean, obviously I know you're not a legal professional, but, as your journey through this, legal and incarceration, are there, one of the things that struck me was like, he had been asking, Vince, the other Dr. Gilmer, had been like asking for medicine for years and years and years, and no one had given it to him. And then once, he got the diagnosis and they started treating him, he was like, oh, this is working for me. Mm-hmm. It was like, are there any, even just like smaller common sense things of like, more doctors within the judicial system, within the incarceration to jails, or like, is there anything that is a common sense legal thing that we can do that would impact change kind of greatly for the 60% of our, incarcerated inmates?
Yeah, there's a ton of low-hanging fruit opportunities. Last 4th of July, I had this experience where we had our car parked in a parking lot, and someone was just bashing a backpack full of beer into the car and just crushing the door. And I walked out and said, sir, what are you doing? And he said, there's a police officer in your car. I'm trying to get them out. Like, he was clearly not right. And the cops showed up. And the cop asked me if I wanted to press charges. I said no. And I said, he needs to be obviously in a hospital tonight. He doesn't need to be in jail. So he went to the hospital that night. And I asked the officer in that moment, I was like, what is your night going to look like tonight? And he said, there'll be another 100 cases just like this. And I said, well, what would be the ideal scenario for you? And I said, how would it be if you had a doctor or a social worker or a psychiatric nurse practitioner riding with you in your car all night? And he said, I would be like Captain America. And those types of opportunities are emerging in many communities across the country, where you're diverting people to mental health facilities rather than to jails. And they're great examples of that model working all over the place. But until there's a social worker embedded in every law enforcement agency or a psychiatrist associated with law enforcement agencies, it's really hard, because most cops don't have mental health training.
Right. Yeah.
If they do, it's like a few hours.
Yeah.
And so we can't expect them, can't hold them to be accountable for interacting with people who are suffering from acute mental crises. Yeah. But judges are waking up to this. Like, okay. Judges are tired of people with severe mental illness being in their jails.
Yeah.
Because they know, the correctional officers know, the judges know, even the prosecutors know that it's not the right place for them. And so they're looking for other opportunities. It just hasn't become a universal step for everyone.
Yeah. Just going back to, the other Dr. Gilmer specifically, as you kind of got more invested in his story and, doing the research, do you remember what it was like meeting him for the first time?
Oh, yeah. When I was terrified, I'd never been to a prison before. And that alone was like terrifying, to go into a supermax prison. Being a privileged white person, I never experienced that before. And in my mind, I had built up who this person would be. And I imagined him to be this hulking sort of monster of a person physically. And he was the opposite of that. He was a frail, elderly looking person. He's just 8 years older than me, who sort of shuffled over to my table, who had this what we call dyskinesias in his face and these writhing sort of hands. He looked like someone you would imagine from Straight Out of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Like, it was that, he looked insane. And after speaking to him, it was very hard for him to communicate. Like, words didn't come easy. Like, I can remember every minute of that encounter because it was so powerful. But I left that encounter realizing that he was not a faker, that he could not be faking these symptoms, which is what everybody believed during his trial, that he had to be either severely mentally ill or neurologically ill. And then I watched him walk away, and he had a sort of shuffling gait, which is indicative of more of a neurologic problem. So that hence was born the suspicion that he probably had a deeply neurologic issue.
How did you come to his diagnosis? And he visited again with a psychiatric professional or whatever it was. What was kind of that process of, actually giving him a diagnosis other than, oh, something's wrong with the eyeball test?
Well, in my mind, I had like 10 different diagnoses or possible diagnoses, and so that's what we do in medicine. We build differential diagnoses, and after I sort of snuck in a psychiatrist, like to observe him. My question was he sociopathic? And I wanted him to answer that question. And we were 30 seconds moving outside outside of the prison, and the psychiatrist Steve Bowie said, "There's no way he's a sociopath, impossible. But have you considered Huntington's disease, which is a genetically inherited autosomal dominant disease that comes from one of your parents?" And then I started going through the checklist in my mind, although I'd never seen a Huntington's patient before. But I was trying to remember back from medical school what those symptoms were. And by the time we made it to the car and picked up our phones, like, we were both convinced that he could have like Huntington's disease. Luckily, it's one of those diseases that you can do a genetic test for. But that's a hard thing to do for an incarcerated person who was deemed to be a cold-blooded murderer by the judge. But I met one of the forensic psychiatrists in the prison who called me and said, "Hey, I hear you think you know what's wrong with this guy." And I begged him to get the testing, and it came back positive. So he had been misdiagnosed and expressing these symptoms throughout the trial, the time he killed his father, and throughout his 10 years in prison at the time. Yeah, which is interesting because one of the detectives labeled him to be a faker of his symptoms, and because he was a doctor, he would know how to fake his symptoms. And once you label someone with a bias like that, it's so easy to proliferate that bias and to taint everyone who had come into contact with him with that bias. And so every member of the jury believed that he was a faker. And it took one voice to instill that. Once you have a deeply seated intrinsic bias, it becomes very hard to reverse that bias. Even if you have a genetic DNA-confirmed diagnosis, it's so hard. A lot of the correctional officers still think that he's faking these symptoms. Yeah.
So this was, you said at that point he'd been incarcerated for 10 years. It's now going on 18-ish, so that he's still in jail. How have you just spent 15, 18 years of your life with this man? How has that journey been for you to just kind of just continuously banging your head against the wall and not seeing the progress, and just for you to keep going and keep working with him to kind of get a diagnosis and fight for his rights and his freedom?
Yeah, well, a lot of mixed emotions. He inspired me. When you become connected to someone, you don't just turn your back. And for me, it was owning up to the the oath that I took as a doctor to do no harm. And then I started re-examining myself in terms of what is our social responsibility as physicians, not hearing many other physicians in the press or certainly on CNN, you don't hear doctors other than like Sanjay Gupta who are talking about the social issues, and this was like a social issue. Being incarcerated as a mentally ill person, that is a failure of the society. And then this man sort of became like a brother to me because we would visit prison all the time. My kids have kind of grown up in that prison, getting to know him, and then I got really angry because they rejected Governor McAuliffe rejected our clemency petition. The next governor rejected our clemency petition, and then I decided to write this book, realizing the importance of leveraging media with politicians who are making decisions about people's lives, because there's no accountability in that equation. Oftentimes because politicians are seeking their next job. And many politicians make very humane decisions, but there's no ultimate accountability. And so I wanted Vance's story to be known well in a way that would, A, inspire the governor to read it and to learn about Vance's case and to recognize that that this was a violation of the 8th Amendment, which is cruel and unusual punishment. And that's what it is to people who are experiencing severe mental illness, who are in prison. Like, that is cruel and unusual punishment. And it's easy for us to say that and to see that as through a clinical lens. It's more difficult, I think, to see that through a prosecutorial lens or through the lens of a correctional officer. And so I wanted people to understand the concept of mental illness and to see it through my lens, which is that the brain is fallible. It's an organ like any other that can fail, that can be influenced by factors that oftentimes steal away our ability to make the right decision, and that can steal even our ability to have free will. As a neuroscientist, that concept to me was really important. And I wanted to believe and share that Vance's story could bring more empathy to this type of legal decision making.
Yeah, I don't think I'm spoiling anything. So he did eventually get granted clemency by one of the governors, but still in jail. How does that happen?
I ask that question every morning. I wake up and I wonder, how is this possible? Because we are now 2 years after he's been granted his clemency. So he's broken the record, actually, as far as I know, for someone who's been exonerated, granted clemency, and who continues to live as an incarcerated person behind bars, which is astonishing, right? You would think that our system would be set up with the intention of rehabilitation, and if you were running a prison and someone was let free, wouldn't you want to enable that to happen? That hasn't happened because I've learned much about my own system, like the medical system, which is there's such poor access to mental health resources, hospitals, and Vince is a complicated patient. And so hospitals are oftentimes for-profit. Most of our system in medicine is a business. It's a for-profit system. Vince is a complicated, expensive patient. And a lot of hospital systems are risk averse. And he will, even though he's exonerated, he will always be a murderer in many people's minds. And it's so hard to erase that. But I did find a hospital, and that hospital said yes, and then after 5 months, they said no. And that was my own hospital who did that. And that's Mission Hospital in Asheville. And so that was a big blow to us because we had worked really hard to build that relationship with them. It was a perfect place for him to be because I would be able to take care of him there. My colleagues would be able to take care of him there. They wanted to take care of him there. And then they said, no, we're not going to do it. We had to go back to the drawing board. And this is after visiting most of the hospitals in North Carolina, Duke, UNC, Atrium, all these different large hospital systems that have the resources to take care of a patient like that. This is after raising $100,000 to pay for his hospital care. And then we had a hospital step up, another hospital, a small hospital, a Christian hospital not far from Asheville, who asked the right questions, like what would Jesus do in this moment? And I said, well, Jesus would take this guy. And they said, yes, he would. And then we learned that the parole board changed the conditions for his release. And the governor said that he simply needed to be released to a suitable hospital. The parole board now said he needed to be released to a locked hospital. Hospitals are not locked. We don't want our hospitals to be locked. We want people to visit patients in hospitals. And so now we're stuck in this conundrum where we're having to battle the current governor of Virginia to change the parole conditions so that he can be released to a suitable hospital, which is any hospital, which will always be a better option than being in prison. And he's unfortunately in the downward spiral of dying. So that inspires me to keep working to release him.
What is we're just relying on the governor now to change his rules? Is that kind of where you're at with it?
So we're relying on the parole board to change their conditions, which would be helpful to have a governor on board.
Yeah, okay.
To do that is very hard.
Yeah.
It requires lots of voices, which is probably the greatest lesson that I've learned in this story is how to leverage voices.
Yeah.
And how voices together can lead to change. And that's, for Vince's case, that's, it's taken, probably a couple $1 million of legal voices, a podcast about him that had 20 million listeners, a CNN documentary, a feature film that's being made, a book that has been widely read, and you would think that would be enough, but it's not. I was sort of naive thinking that we would be able to get him out easily, and that drawing more attention to his case would be helpful, which it has. I mean, it led ultimately to his release.
Yeah.
After the governor actually rejected our clemency petition, and after I got pre-release copies of the book, which I gave to distributed throughout their office, and somebody read it because it was just a week or two later that they changed their mind on his last day in office.
Wow.
So, which I think is a good example of the power of storytelling.
Yeah.
The power of leveraging media for very direct points of entry, and for him it was like elevating his story and holding these folks accountable, which is what we're still trying to do. It's just requiring much more effort than I ever imagined, to achieve freedom for him, and also to help us focus in our realm of medicine to reflect on why our system is so dysfunctional, and how can we improve access to care for folks with mental illness and folks with cardiac issues or whatever. It's a big problem in our country.
Yeah, so this idea of storytelling, this is going to be my last question, I think, unless I come up with another one, but we're on a college campus. I work in the Department of Communication. A lot of my students call themselves storytellers, aspire to be storytellers. What's advice that you have for a college student who is saying, I want to leverage storytelling and the power of the media for change? What's just advice for kind of the people, since we're on a college campus right now?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And in many ways I wrote this book for students. I had students in mind, and the sort of mantra or sort of structure that I've been following or have adopted is taking leveraging firstly your curiosity. And so I see for students, for all humans, it's the essence of telling a story as being firstly curious, and then doing the journalistic deep dive. being intrigued and diving deep. And that was what I did with the book and with our podcast, spending many years like diving into the nuances of this man's life and story. But I think for studentship, like allowing yourself to be transformed by something deeply, to be moved by something deeply, to your core in a way that gives you energy and strength to pursue a story to the furthest end of it. And once, for me, like that was seeing the prison system and recognizing that, you know, there are 10 times more people with mental illness in prison than in all of our mental hospitals. And being open to recognizing that that's just wrong. Incorporating emotion into that, being angry and intrigued, inflamed all at the same time. And then, you know, I think the beauty of being a student is that you have space to actually reflect and vision and be a creator. And that is like really unique to studentship, I think. Because when you become an older adult, that life kind of squeezes that precious space of creating out of our bones. And in medicine, that it's true in many ways. We become very like left-brained, focused, and we forget about all the other stuff. We forget about the creative. We forget about the right hemisphere of our brain. All those things that like can make us enthralled and captured by whatever story you're telling. And anybody can learn how to tell a story, but I think it's like capturing the story that transforms you and inspires you that will ultimately lead to advocacy, but you have to like sit with it, you have to reflect on it, and then you have to leverage it. And that's, you know, like you are a professional about leveraging story. I didn't know anything about story or leveraging the media. I didn't know anything, but I was a very curious person. And putting those two together that's where change happens, I think. And this is how people in general like listen. Like I've spoken to a lot of politicians, they love listening through story. They don't like being lectured to, but if you can tell them a story, or if you can tell a patient a story, or if the patient can tell you a story, like that's where understanding happens. But the part that you're teaching to your students, which is so important, is like, how do you get your story out? And I was sort of lucky in a way in that, I had a lot of people who helped me. I had a great agent. I had film people who've helped me along the way, and those are the connections that are more difficult. But anybody can tell the story if you grab onto it and you're tenacious to spend time with it.
Well, his story is the other Dr. Gilmer. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Austin.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate it.